Yeah, all right. We're just allowing everyone into the room here, so it is 1 o'clock. We'll get started probably around 1:02 today, just to make sure that if there is any particular people that are still trying to join us, that hopefully they'll be able to still do so. Um, I'll just like to welcome you again. Thank you for joining us, and we'll get started here shortly. I believe someone else just joined us. We'll get started at about 1:02 p.m. Just to make sure that some certain people may be able to join us if they haven't just yet. I believe I saw the attendee numbers go up. We'll get started around 1:02 p.m. And we'll get rolling here. About 30 seconds or less. All right. So it is 1:02, so I will get started with our session today. First, I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar on ergonomics in the fishing industry in collaboration with our partners at the Workers' Compensation Board of Nova Scotia. I know today's session will have some excellent information on this, so it's great that you're able to join us this afternoon. My name is Brad Wells. I'm an Awareness and Outreach Officer with the Safety Branch. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that where I am located is presently part of McNaughey. We would like to acknowledge them as part of our past, present, and future caretakers of this land, and that our relationship is based on the spirit and intent of our sacred peace and friendship treaties. So today we have our subject matter expert, Sean Budden, who's an ergonomist with the Workers' Compensation Board and a certified ergonomic professional. Sean will lead us through and help discussion with regards to the unique demands in the ergonomics in the fishing industry, and we'll have some useful information on dealing with them. You will have opportunities to ask questions at the end of the presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the raise your hand feature in Teams. We will try to take your questions in order as best we can, and as you see that they are raised. Also, you can feel free to use the Teams chat feature to ask questions as they arise during the presentation, and we will address those following the presentation. Again, I just make sure it does have a feature with regards to Q&A in this particular webinar, but we would ask that at this particular point in time, you use the chat feature if you, in fact, are typing any questions in throughout the presentation. So please note again, we are recording this session. It will be placed on to our website in the near future, so it'll be available for those who may not be able to join us today, or if you would like to view it again in the future. So with that, I'll hand things over to Sean, and he'll lead us off from there. Go ahead, Sean.
Thanks, Brad. And hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Like Brad said, my name's Sean. I'm an ergonomist with the Workers' Compensation Board here in Nova Scotia. Been with the board about 5 years now, and my educational background is kinesiology and ergonomics, and I've taken the OH&S certification through U of A. And yeah, so I hope you enjoy the chat today and walk away with a bit of a better understanding of how you guys can either help your workplace or the workplaces that you interact with in terms of preventing sprains and strains. So session overview. So there's just kind of some things we'll touch on today. So we'll go over MSIs or musculoskeletal injuries, just so everyone has kind of a basic understanding of what they are if you're not completely familiar with them, why they matter. So like we'll go over some stats and some information, injury information, and then the big chunk of it will be how do we prevent these injuries. What does this look like, the systems and kind of processes that we can put in place. And throughout the presentation, I'll touch on some resources, ones that I kind of reach to if I'm looking for any information or looking for things to help me in my work. And so I use those quite a bit. So I wanted to share them with you. And there will be a slide at the very end as well, kind of touching on all the resources that we focus on. A theme of today will kind of be how ergonomics fits into like a broader safety management system. And so I encourage you to think about your own organization and what you guys are doing internally for safety in general. So if an injury happens, how do you go investigate it? How are you a little more proactive in terms of identifying hazards and figuring out what can hurt your workforce? And kind of think about what those processes look like and see how the ergonomics related content we talk about here today can kind of integrate within that. So it's kind of a theme of integrating ergonomics into kind of our safety management system and not just having it as a standalone program, which is one option that we'll kind of touch on a tiny bit. But for the majority of the time, we want to be sustainable and make sure kind of ergonomics is just another hazard that we're integrating into our safety system and safety processes. So what are MSIs? Or musculoskeletal disorders. So they're an injury or disorder to the muscles, tendons, ligaments, nerves, joints, blood vessels, and any related soft tissue. You may have heard of musculoskeletal disorders, repetitive strain injury, overuse disorder. All those terms are really kind of that umbrella term for the definition here. And they're all kind of talking about the same thing. I know it's confusing, and I'm sure myself, I would love if everyone kind of came to an agreement on what we're going to call these injuries and disorders. But so if you do see, even kind of in the presentation here today, I'll touch on MSDs a little bit as well, because that's used a lot in Ontario. But all the terms are kind of talking about these sprains and strains. Inflammation, and some of the symptoms are your pain, numbness, tingling, weakness, and sleep disturbances as well. These injuries, they can occur kind of in a moment, lifting a lobster crate, pushing a cart, using a dolly. They can kind of occur in an instant, or they can occur over a period of time. Us here at WCB use over a period of time for injuries that there's not kind of that specific incident. They can be hard to investigate sometimes for organizations. So if you do have a worker come to you and talk about kind of a shoulder pain or back pain, and they don't have that specific incident, it's kind of, the last week or the last month, it's kind of progressed to a point that I can't work anymore, or I need to go for physio or something like that. It can be difficult for organizations to investigate and go out and say, hey, what was the issue here and how do we fix it? So we'll kind of touch on some tools a little bit later that can help you with that, kind of understand the overall demands of a job. That's kind of what MSIs are. And the next question is really kind of like, how do they happen? What part of the workplace, what are the hazards in the workplace that can kind of lead to these types of injuries? So these are known as ergonomic hazards. The main four that we kind of see, so if you think about all the incident reports that you guys see, or all the claims that come through WCB that are labeled as your sprain, strain, your MSI, there's really four main factors that come into play. So repetitive movements, awkward postures, managing heavy physical loads or like high forces, and then inadequate breaks or like long duration activities. Those are kind of the main four. And just because you have an awkward posture or a repetitive movement doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have an injury. We typically see these MSIs, the sprains, strains, pop up when you have like multiple of these risk factors together in a task. So some examples, lifting lobster crates, you might have some awkward postures, lifting from the floor, managing heavy physical loads. They're fairly heavy depending on what type of crate they are and what's in them. Awkward posture might also be like trying to lift it away from your body. So the further an object is away from your body, the more awkward the posture, the more demand on your back and heavier to lift. Shoveling ice is another big one I see kind of in this industry, out of those large fish totes. And so again, there's kind of your awkward posture, bending over, reaching with the shovel could be a factor in there. The weight of the shovel, the weight of the amount of ice, are we repetitively shoveling the ice out? Or are there kind of breaks and lulls throughout the day that we're able to rest and recover? And so it's really kind of about looking at the tasks that you might see injuries at, and breaking it down into these kind of ergonomic hazards. Another thing that I like to think about with awkward posture is like typically when we hear awkward posture, we always think like our back bending over, our shoulders kind of reaching up high. But it's really every joint in the body has like optimal angles that works better at. And then when it gets to your like end range of motions, is where we typically see the injuries happen. Our body's a little less able to produce force and produce movement at those postures. And one example I always like to use, some people have maybe seen me do this before, so I always like to think of like our wrist, for example. And so, and you guys can do this with me. So if you hold your wrist out straight, hopefully you guys can see me, and you want to keep your wrist at a nice neutral angle, and you're just going to hold your hand out in front of you and squeeze two fingers in your hand there. And you can kind of feel the amount of force that you can produce in that posture. And then if we're thinking of an awkward posture or like end range of motion, if you flex your hand all the way down, so you're in an awkward posture, and then put your two fingers back in and keep your hand kind of flexed all the way down and see, and you can squeeze your two fingers and see the amount of force that you're able to produce. And so in those kind of end range motions, the awkward postures, the amount of force we're able to produce is a lot lower. And so if you think of those in the workplaces, whether it's lifting, shoveling, packing containers, if our body is always in those awkward postures, we're much more likely to sustain injury and be exposed to injuries. So on the left there, four main kind of hazards, and then on the right, so we have, and these are kind of hazards that are influence the likelihood of an MSI or sprain strain occurring. So psychosocial, so like the perceived pace of work, control over the pace of work. If you think of like an assembly line or a product line, if the workers need to work at the rate of the line, they don't have control over it, and they're just kind of working as fast as they need to for the line. Kind of your social relationships at work, your like your support from coworkers and management, that would fall under your psychosocial hazards as well. Temperature, so your extreme heats and colds. Again, I'm sure if anyone's been extremely hot or extremely cold, your body functions less optimally in those kind of conditions. So when we're at work in those conditions, we're more likely to sustain a sprain or strain. Vibrations, if we're using any tools that create vibration on our hand and arm, vibration over longer periods of time can cause an impact to the blood vessels and the nerves, and lead to different types of MSIs. Contact stress is another big one, especially if we're using like our hand as like a hammer, or like in kind of lobster processing facilities. If we're breaking down the lobsters, whether it's the claw or the tail, and kind of using our hand and our thumb to break that apart, that can be contact stress over a longer period of time, which can lead to kind of your hand, your thumb, wrist injuries. So we really need to kind of be aware of when that's coming into play. So that's kind of like how the injuries happen. And from that, it's in terms of, if we think of like the broader system of just like safety and identifying hazards, these ergonomic hazards would kind of get lumped into the methods and the ways that we identify all other hazards. And so if we take a step back and we think of the hazards in the workplace, so I went onto the CCOHS website, and they had 7 categories for hazards. I've seen a few different ways of grouping them together, but for today, that's the example that they had. And so again, kind of thinking of ergonomic hazards right along the other one. So we're going out and looking at the chemicals in the workplace and controlling for exposures to those. We're thinking of physical hazards, so kind of poor air quality and noise levels. We're going out and controlling for those. So we want to kind of put ergonomic hazards, the forces, the awkward postures, the levels of vibration. We want to kind of put those right in the same wheelhouse as our other hazards, and go out and identify them and assess them in some of the same ways. And there are some nuances to kind of how we figure out kind of what are the ergonomic hazards in the workplace and what's their risk level. So we'll kind of dive down to that, but I just wanted to make sure that we're kind of thinking of these hazards in line with everything else. So if we start at kind of a high level in terms of like injury data, this is a report from WCB that came out a couple of weeks ago for 2023 stats. And again, this is Nova Scotia in general. We'll kind of take a bit of a step down to some fishing specific information, but WCB or Nova Scotia in general, 63.4% of physical injuries were sprains and strains, kind of making it the most common type of workplace injury in Nova Scotia in 2023. And that's been pretty consistent over the years. It's kind of in that low 60 range in terms of the percentage of injuries that are coming in that get labeled as a sprain or strain. So they continue to be an issue and something that we should focus on. And so if we think of the where on the body Nova Scotians are getting hurt, so again, this is kind of part of that injury report for 2023 that WCB released a couple weeks ago. The back was kind of the main area that we saw the injuries at 23.5%. And I wanted to kind of show this data is mainly because I think it's important to kind of track, but it's also important to look at, like, are you guys tracking your internal data, and what is that showing you? Is it more or less in terms of MSIs and sprain strains? Are you guys at 80%? In terms of overall injuries, is it lower? It's important to know, because that's going to direct you in terms of do we really want to focus on the ergonomic hazards, or is it more of the physical hazards or chemical hazards? And I think knowing where your injuries are coming from allows you to kind of manage that and move forward. It's that classic saying that we manage what we measure. And so if we're measuring it and getting the injury data and the injury stats, we're more likely to manage it and manage the correct hazards in a good way. So that's some kind of overall WCB information in terms of Nova Scotia wide. And so if we look at the fishing sector, and so I pulled some of this information, and so this was from 2020, 2021, and 2022. I did this before the 2023 stats came out, so I didn't include that on here. But this is for all registered claims in the fishing sector, so that's harvesting, processing, aquaculture, and I wanted to see kind of where the MSIs were in terms of registered claims. And so 2020, there was 500 and some odd registered claims, and 43% of those were MSIs. In 2021, again, 550-ish registered claims, and 36% were MSIs. And then even in 2022, that decreased a little bit further. So all registered claims came down a little bit to under 500, and 33% of those were MSIs. So I mean, this is good trends. The overall number of registered claims were going down, and the number of MSIs were going down as well. I thought it was interesting that in terms of overall MSIs, like percentages, Nova Scotia is at like the high 60s, and this was at 33. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And I mean, good news in general. You always want to see those downward trends. And so this is kind of every claim that comes in is considered registered claim. And so I wanted to also see what the story was for time loss injuries. And so that's here on the next slide. And so time loss claims are if anyone misses 3 or more days from work, it's considered a time loss claim. And so I wanted to track time loss claims and what percentage of those were MSIs. And so obviously there's a lower number of time loss claims compared to registered claims. And so in 2020, roughly just under 200 time loss claims, and 44% of those were MSIs. 2021, roughly the same amount of time loss claims, 46% were MSIs. And then in 2022, a little bit of a dip in terms of total time loss claims, but the percentage of MSIs went up a little bit to 52%. So when we look at the time loss claims, which are typically are more severe injuries because people need time off work to recover and do physio and any other kind of therapy and treatment that they may need, we're seeing a higher percent of MSI injuries. And so not only is that kind of a more severe injury, but it's the impact to the worker and to the organization is also more. I mean, for the worker, they're off work, so they're not making as much money. They're not able to do the same things that they were able to do around the house, whether that's leisure or recreationally. And then the impact to the business is greater as well. They lost a worker. They might need more time training others to kind of fill that role. And they also spend kind of valuable time with the administrative tasks that are required for incident investigation, WCB reporting, return to work planning, and that kind of thing. And so there is kind of that dollar amount tied to those more severe injuries. And at 52%, that's more than half of those kind of severe injuries. So definitely worth taking a look. And it'd be interesting to see kind of, again, I mean, these are kind of industry-wide, Nova Scotia-wide stats. So it would be, if I kind of were in your guys' shoes, I'd want to see what are my stats compared to this? Are we doing worse, better? If it is 52% kind of time loss claims that are MSIs, it's definitely worth taking a look into those injury types and seeing how can we prevent these and how do we get that number lower. So I wanted to touch on a little bit of the cost of a claim as well. This is some kind of like averages in terms of cost of an MSI. So there's kind of your direct cost and your indirect cost. And so your direct costs are like your physio, your any kind of physician reports, any treatment, braces, that kind of stuff. And this is the average cost of an MSI. Again, I use 2022 data for the fishing industry. So again, the 3 different sectors. And it came out that the average kind of direct cost was $5,986. Of those direct costs, I think it's also really important to look at the indirect costs as well. So indirect costs are things like administrative tasks on incident investigations, a manager's time away from their duties to complete those or follow-up reports, extra training that you need to kind of put someone in the place of a worker who is off work, and those sorts of things as well. So really important to not only concentrate on the direct cost, but the indirect costs. And I feel like the indirect costs just don't get calculated as much. It's a little more difficult to kind of figure out what they are. And so I got these numbers from the Cree MSD group out of Ontario. They created a cost benefits calculator for MSIs, or they call them MSDs. They used a information from the Washington State calculator, which is very similar. It's a cost benefit calculator for MSIs. And so their range is from 1.1 to 4.5 times the direct cost for indirect costs. So a little bit of a wide margin or a range, I guess. And it really comes down to they used a higher kind of ratio for cheaper claims. and then a lower ratio for more expensive claims. So if you think of a sprain strain that costs $1,000, some of the administrative costs for that claim are going to be stable compared to like a more expensive. You're always going to have a manager who goes out and does a WCB incident report. You're always going to have some sort of incident investigation, and some of those kind of costs are fixed. And then for some of the more expensive claims, there's just more return to work and those sorts of things. So there is a bit of a range in terms of the indirect costs. For this calculation here, I kept it conservative and just used the 1.1. So even if we kind of use the lowest amount of indirect costs, it's still $6,584 with a total cost of $12,570. So we can kind of see that the dollar amounts for these claims start to add up pretty quickly, especially when we take into account those kind of indirect costs, like the lack or loss of production from some of those injuries on the back end. So I'd be very interested to see, do any of you guys calculate indirect costs? How do you do it? And kind of what information or what kind of calculations are you using? I've seen a wide variety of kind of how people do it, but this is the one that seems to be pretty consistent and makes sense in terms of our numbers and stuff. So that resource, the cost benefit calculator, feel free to go take a look at it, especially if you're implementing any kind of MSI ergonomic controls and things like that. Their data is from Ontario, so any of their numbers on their calculator are Ontario costs. But I did take a quick look and compared them to some of our injury data for your guys' industry, and it's roughly similar, but definitely take their numbers with a bit of a grain of salt. And you could even kind of use your own internal data if you do have it. So I guess the next step is we kind of have our injury data. We know MSIs are greater than 50% for the industry in terms of the time loss claims. Where human factors or ergonomics comes into this is on the how do we prevent these injuries from happening. Human factors and ergonomics, they're kind of interchangeable in terms of their terms. We use ergonomics here in Canada. Human factors is more of a European term, but they're really talking about the same thing. And I think the image here, I just wanted to kind of highlight that ergonomics, a lot of the time we think about the physical factors. So we think of biomechanics and anatomy and physiology and anthropometrics, but it's kind of a very holistic approach to how people and humans interact in the workplace, taking into consideration things like memory, human-computer interaction, participation in a group, and those kind of organizational factors. So it's much more than just kind of the physical factors, which is usually what we're focusing on. And I mean, as like a simple definition, it's fitting the job to the person. So we come in all different kind of shapes and sizes. And abilities. In the definition of ergonomics, it's matching kind of like the jobs and the systems and the environment of the work to the capabilities and the limitations of the worker. And so fitting the job to the person, we want to make sure we understand what are the capabilities and the limitations, and how do we fit the job, and can we change the job and the work to fit the people that we have on our staff and the people that will be coming in the future. Because we're always looking to hire people and what's the job pool like, and the more people that we can fit into a job, or the more people that are capable of doing that job, the better off we're going to be for hiring and recruiting and those sorts of things. So again, kind of a holistic approach to safety in the workplace and those ergonomic hazards. One other quote I heard the other day and I liked, it's in terms of like design, and you can think of it in terms of like if you're redoing a workstation or redoing a job or a task, and so you want to design work so that the short can reach, the tall can fit, and the weak can lift. And so if you're able to do that, at least to a certain degree, can't design for everybody. That's impossible. But if you can design for like the averages, and so most people could kind of fit into that job, then you're going to be better off. And that's kind of the anthropometrics of work. I guess the question that comes with that is like, what sizes are people coming to work? How strong or how weak are they, and those sorts of things. So we'll touch on some assessments later on that can kind of help you answer those questions. Because if we need to know what a workstation height should be, or how heavy an item should be to push, pull, lift, carry, like where do we go to get that information? And there's some assessments coming up that we'll touch on. So how does ergonomics fit into my organization? There's kind of two different approaches that we can take. So there's the dedicated team approach. That's kind of having, and again, if you think of like your safety management system, you can kind of, I always think of like the dedicated team as like a Josh committee. Some people call it like a change team. In the ergonomics world, it's like a participatory ergonomics approach, but it's kind of having a dedicated team to tackle some ergonomic hazards and ergonomic programs. That's one way of doing it. Typically, those are found in like larger organizations, and or maybe an organization that has a large number of sprains and strains, and they want to kind of tackle it quick and efficiently. So that dedicated team might be the approach. The integrated approach is another one. So integrating kind of ergonomics into your health and safety management system. That's another kind of way of doing it. That's the one I typically coach when I'm working with employers. It's very sustainable. So if you think of like employee turnover, if you had a dedicated team and there was 3 or 4 individuals that were on it, if 2 leave and go to a different part of the organization or leave the organization totally, that's kind of a big hit to that team. So the integrated approach kind of, and I touched on it earlier, so in kind of intertwining ergonomics into your health and safety processes. So if it's hazard assessment or hazard ID, have kind of an applicable ergonomics section to that. Or if it's an incident investigation, make sure that the process or tool that you go out and actually investigate with takes into account your sprain and your strain and your over period of time injuries and that kind of thing. So 2 different approaches. It's really kind of up to you and how you think that will fit into your organization. And what's best for you guys. So if we think about so ergonomics is very like systematic approach. These are a couple kind of resources that I use. So there's a CSA standard on workplace ergonomics. Us here at WCB, we have a 6-step MSI guide or MSI prevention guide, kind of to prevent sprains and strains. The CRE MSD group out of Ontario also has kind of a 10-step approach and some information there. There's a lot of kind of like overlap between the 3 different options. I'll talk about the 6-step guide from Nova Scotia here today. Mainly because I use it a little bit more and just a little bit more familiar with it. But all of these 3 really kind of follow along if you've kind of looked at like the CSA standard for like health and safety management systems, or if you look at the Plan, Do, Check, Act that your kind of cycle that your health and safety management system has, all of these kind of fit in line with that. They have kind of your hazard ID, your risk assessment, your control, training, evaluation. It all kind of fits really nicely into just your general safety practices, which is nice because it makes it easy to look at your safety management system or the safety processes that you currently do and say, hey, we have some MSIs that I want to deal with. I want to take some of this ergonomic stuff and put it into our safety practices. And it makes it pretty easy to just kind of like drag and drop into that. And I mean, depending on where your level of need is for MSI prevention and ergonomics, you can take some stuff, a little bit, a lot of it, and kind of go from there, and kind of choose your own adventure in terms of what information and processes you want to put in place. These are kind of major themes that overlap from those three kind of programs that I just went over. Again, kind of very safety oriented things. So a planning stage. So how are we actually going to go out and find our ergonomic hazards? So if there's tasks that have heavy lifting, difficult pushing and pulling, repetitive movements, we need to plan how we're actually going to go out and find that stuff. Because if you can't just go out and assess every task, you want to have a bit of a systematic approach to going out and figuring that out. Awareness and training, again, whether it's building some knowledge within your staff, frontline workers or management, whoever's doing kind of the hazard assessments, who goes out and investigates an injury when it happens. So you want to build some awareness and training within that group. The implement is just kind of like the actual doing. So going out and looking for hazards, doing the hazard assessments, going out and investigating our injuries, and that implementation of building controls and that kind of thing. Evaluating and that continued improvement all gets kind of lumped together. And I find that's part of the process that gets left out sometimes or forgotten about. Sometimes we're really good at kind of planning, going out and identifying hazards, awareness and training, kind of building that knowledge, and the implementing, but it's in that kind of evaluating improvement. I don't know if it's just not as exciting or what it is, but that's an area that could definitely use some improvement sometimes. And then kind of the overarching or dispersed all the way through it is the leadership, commitment, and worker participation. Those are probably two of the biggest things that I see that can make a difference. For leadership and commitment, making sure that the ergonomics process or program is promoted and maintained and reviewed for that continuous improvement, and measuring objectives and that kind of thing. And the worker participation is huge for sprains and strains and ergonomics, because the MSIs are kind of invisible in a sense. I can walk by someone at a product line or hauling lobster crates off a boat, and it might look like maybe they do it every day, or I've seen them do it every day, and I walk by and they haven't said anything to me. So I don't really see that discomfort and pain. And so they're kind of invisible in that sense. Unless you've kind of done the work and you're like, oh, that's really difficult on the back. We just kind of go through our day to day, and sometimes miss those things. And so the worker participation, right from like hazard ID and planning all the way through to what are some things that we can put in place to control the risk and prevent these injuries. It's super important because of that kind of invisibility or invisible nature of these types of injuries. And then when we get to the flip side of like, we need to put things in place in the workplace so that we can reduce the chance of an injury. Typically, the frontline workers are the ones that have to use that equipment. They have to go with the process that we decided. And so having them involved in the whole way increases that buy-in, makes it a little bit easier when we've come back and be like, here's what we're about to do. Maybe it was one of their suggestions in terms of, I think we should do this. I think this is the way to reduce the injuries out here, reduce the demand. And so if it's one of their ideas, it's even better. That kind of spreads throughout the organization a little bit quicker. Whereas if I'm a manager or a safety professional and I go out to a group of kind of frontline workers and I'm like, we've identified there's a high risk for shoulders. There's a lot of reaching or repetitive movements, and this is what we're going to do to prevent it. And I just kind of throw it at them. There's a lot more room for them to complain and kind of reject it. Whereas if it's kind of their own idea or they've been a part of the process, they might understand it a little bit more, have a little bit more buy-in. So especially for kind of these MSI sprains and strains and this type of work and the ergonomics, it's important to have that kind of worker participation. So I'll kind of go through the 6-step guide that we have at WCB. I'll go through the different steps and try to give some examples along the way that are kind of applicable to your guys' industry and some of the work that you do. If you have any questions, any specific questions, definitely feel free to throw them in the chat, and we can talk about them at the end here. And so this is kind of available on our WorkSafe for Life, and I'll just kind of touch on each of these pieces here. So the consultation and communication, I kind of just emphasized it with, it's that worker participation. It's the communication channels between decision makers, whether that's a manager, a safety professional, an executive, a director level, and the workers, having those communication channels about the hazards and why they exist. Sometimes we think we know why there's a awkward posture or a difficult kind of push-pull carry. But the workers typically have a very kind of like intimate knowledge of the processes and the flows, and they might be doing things different for a specific reason. So very important to involve them in the process, identifying hazards, educating them on hazards and signs and symptoms of injury, as well as building up their awareness about MSI hazards and set goals for improvements. I find this one comes up sometimes in like training, so we can train our workers on body mechanics and safe lifting. But if we're not kind of going out and evaluating the current level of awareness, we might not know that the workers aren't kind of picking up on what we're training them for. So any kind of training, especially on like the items that need some perhaps like more hands-on approach, you want to have some way of evaluating, like, are the workers catching on to the body mechanics of best lifting practices and stuff like that. I had one organization that did like management one-on-ones. So they would go out into the workplace and just kind of have conversations about hazards, about safety, and ergonomics kind of was included in there. And they had pieces about like their training. So they just had little, it was like a question and answer thing. And that allowed them to get a little bit of feedback in terms of, is the training that we're doing working, and are the workers kind of picking up on the things that we're training them for? And so it just gives you a little bit of feedback, especially for like the training element, because you kind of see in real time in the workplace, are they taking the elements and the approaches that we taught them in more of a classroom or kind of in a training setting? Are they actually taking that and applying it to their day-to-day work? So the education and awareness, so a couple of ways to kind of spread word about safety. This is some of the things that the organizations I've worked with do. So toolbox talks. Some people use like an easy, just kind of like a question and answer card or sheet, just to kind of have a back and forth conversation about safety. And I mean, you could include kind of, for today's talk, you could include things about MSIs, about ergonomics. So like general question, do people know what an MSI or sprain strain is? Do they know what hazards in the workplace could lead to it? Are people able to go around their workplace and pick out kind of your high forces, your repetitive movements, your awkward postures? And then the other big thing is, especially for frontline workers, do they know what controls or what kind of corrective actions are in place to try and reduce the chance of injury happening? So toolbox talks are great. Workshops kind of in the same line. Best practice, so reach out to your industry safety groups, whether that's locally here with Fish Safe, LSI, WCB, or kind of more on a national basis, look at like Canadian standards. I mentioned the CCOHS earlier. So you never know where you're going to kind of find best practices for your industry, or maybe even like an industry over. Maybe they've kind of figured out some problems that you're trying to solve. Continuous improvement. That's a big one. So maybe establish a team or certain champions. Maybe that's kind of on your safety rep or your your Josh committee to try and kind of push forward the continuous improvement. I find the biggest one for that is create and maintain the systems. And so if you're always going through the process of kind of going through your steps and the plan, do, check, act, and you're kind of flipping it over and looking at it and saying, did this work? What were we measuring? What was our objective? What were we trying to achieve? And did we achieve that? And then going back again and kind of doing the process again to improve it a little bit each time. So I think we need to, again, I said we need to focus on that a little bit more, get a little curious or excited about kind of improving it the next go around. There's a quote, I forget who it's from. It's like ready, fire, aim. And so it's basically talking about like, we don't have to be perfect. If we're ready, we can move ahead with something, and then we aim and we continue it over time and improve it over time. And so I think that's a good kind of analogy for this. If we go out, we try and we kind of establish our system, and then when we go back through the hazard ID and the control, we need to really sit back and say, did it work? What worked well, and what do we need to improve moving forward? Because nothing kind of is perfect the first go around, and we're going to be continuously looking for hazards and implementing controls throughout the next. It just never stops. So it's an important piece of this. So I do think I'm going to skip a couple of slides because I think my animations got all messed up here. So this is kind of the hazard ID piece of things. And so this is the risk identification stage. So we went from education and awareness. We moved on to kind of the let's go out and actually figure out where the hazards are. So if you're in your organization and you've taken a look at a little bit of your data perhaps, and you're trying to figure out where are people hurting themselves or why are they hurting themselves. These are a couple ways, again, kind of integrated into your safety management system, but these are kind of three tools that we have in the hazard ID space to actually gather information and figure out where the injuries are coming from. And so hazard assessments, most people are doing some form of these. So that's kind of a template or a sample from the LSI safety manual for businesses. That one's kind of a blank form in the sense that you can just write in your comments and fill it out. When we're thinking of kind of identifying ergonomic hazards, that's nice because you can label ergonomic hazards right next to a chemical hazard, and so you can kind of go back and forth with your different hazards and go out and assess any area. The probably challenge with that is if you had like whoever's doing your hazard assessments, whether it's a manager, if it's your Josh committee, if it's a safety professional, they would just need to have the kind of the knowledge and awareness to be able to go out and look at a job and look at a task and say, here are my ergonomic hazards. Here's the high forces. Here's the lifting, the pushing, the pulling, the awkward postures, and those sorts of things. So again, pros and cons, and I've seen both work. Some people have more of a checkbox hazard assessment, and it's a little more kind of refined in terms of like what you're able to check. So if that's what you have in terms of hazard assessment, just make sure there's ergonomic, it accounts for ergonomic hazards, and those are options to check and stuff like that. Next step is the workplace inspections. So this is one from FishSafe as a pre-departure checklist. Workplace inspections are common. And so I've worked with organizations to go through whatever workplace inspection they have and just make sure that not only are there checks for electrical, fire, equipment, maintenance, that kind of thing, making sure that there are, it's accounting for kind of your ergonomic hazards. And so if that's what you're using, if you're using in a workplace inspection checklist to try and gather information about hazards or chances of injury, then you can kind of take a look at your workplace inspection. And sometimes it's only a couple of lines, maybe to prevent kind of lifting injuries. People are using carts or dollies, and just making sure in that checklist, making sure that the carts and dollies are available, they're maintained, they're working order, and that kind of thing. So looking at kind of that, what are the controls, and putting that in place. Maybe not so let's go out and identify the hazards, but making sure that the controls in place are actually working and are able to support the worker in their work. Ergonomic assessments are the kind of third one on this list, and we'll take a bit of a deeper dive into those. They're more specific in terms of like being able to highlight those ergonomic hazards that we talked about earlier. So the force, the repetition, and they're built specifically for that. So the three that I'll talk about here today, so two of them are on our Work Safe for Life website, the Discomfort Survey and the Workplace Inspection Checklist. That's like a MSI checklist specifically. And then the QEC is the third one that we'll touch on as well. So the discomfort survey, so these are kind of more of your ergonomic assessments. And again, if we take like a step back and think, so we've kind of come from the higher level. Let's say we've taken a look at our data, and we understand MSIs are a bit of a concern in our workplace, but all we have is kind of a few injury reports, and some kind of high level data saying MSIs are an issue. And so these kind of assessments can help you really narrow down your focus from like a organizational level data perspective down to like a specific task and a specific ergonomic hazard. So let's say lifting the lobster crates is the example of the day here. We could get down to, yes, lifting lobster crates in this specific area. And the reason it's an issue is because it's really far out from the body, it's heavy, maybe it's coming out of water, so it's awkward and there's water pouring out of it. And so you can kind of find really what the details of the task are in terms of where the chance of injury is coming from. So discomfort surveys are kind of a job level assessment tool, and you would do them with groups of individuals. And they're really good at identifying trends in tasks that cause discomfort and trends in levels of perceived discomfort. So what you do is you go out and let's say you're with a couple of deckhands, and you go out, and anyone that's like job is grouped together with similar tasks, you can go out and complete the surveys with them, and it's going to get them to list their level of discomfort for different body parts. And the thing I like about it is that it's going to get them to, or it's going to force them to attach a task to that level of discomfort. So let's say I had shoulder discomfort, and it's a 0 to 5 scale. So let's say it was a 4 to 5 shoulder discomfort. It's going to get me to attach a task that I think is either related to or aggravating that kind of shoulder discomfort. So then not only do we have jobs that have some injuries, but we have a task that our workforce is saying, this is kind of aggravating my shoulder. And you want to build trends out of it. So it's not just Sean saying that this task is bad and I hate it. It's you build trends. So within your workforce or within a group of workers, maybe 7 out of 10 of them are saying there's an issue with this task. So that's really the task that you want to go take a look at, not just one kind of louder voice talking about a certain job or a certain task. The inspection checklist is kind of the next level. It goes down to you to actually go out and assess a specific task. So it's an observation tool. So you'd go out and watch a worker do a task, and it identifies higher risk postures and body movements. So it's like a yes or no checklist. And it allows us to get a really good idea of the postures, the body movements, so those hazards, the repetitive movements in the upper body, the awkward postures, bending over, lifting, pushing, pulling, and that sort of thing. And it's a screening tool, so it's super quick and easy to use. Just ask you a question, and it's a yes or no answer to it. The exposure checklist, or the quick exposure checklist, is a little more in-depth assessment tool. I'm not going to take a deep dive into this, but it is a kind of a general ergonomic assessment tool, and it calculates exposure scores for high-risk body segments. So it looks at the back, the shoulders, the neck, and the wrist as well, and it gives you like a numerical value. So for anyone that likes numbers and likes those kind of like heat maps and the risk ratings and stuff, this one does a really good job of giving you kind of a numerical value in terms of the level of risk or level of exposure for like the back and the neck and things like that. So gives you a really detailed look of where you can kind of see where your risk is coming from. So this is a slide I had this in before. This is kind of a follow-up to that. There's kind of two approaches to like risk identification. So and again, this is just kind of like general safety with some ergonomics integrated into it. So you have your reactive approach. So that's your jobs with existing MSIs and related concerns. That's like you're reviewing your injury data. So your first aid, your time loss, your near miss, your WCB reports. It's important to look at that information, but it's also important to try and move to a more proactive approach. So identifying jobs with ergonomic hazards before the injury is actually happening. And so that's kind of your hazard ID that we just talked about, your assessments, your inspections, discomfort surveys, your screening tools, and kind of moving through that line. And even once you get to a more proactive approach, you still want to look at your kind of your data, because you still want to know if there are injuries happening. You want to know where they're happening and investigate those as well. So it's really kind of a balanced approach between the proactive and reactive. As you move down and you do your reviews, if anything comes out with a ergonomic hazard has been identified, the next step is really to figure out how to assign a risk level to a task. And I find thinking about like level of risk and risk levels, it's really important to have some way of doing this so that you can compare not only different ergonomic hazards, so you know if you should go to the quality assurance part of the work, or the more warehouse part with moving the pallets around, or if you need to go to the production line, or maybe the transportation part of the business. You need to be able to know kind of where to go with a apples to apples comparison for MSIs or for ergonomic hazards. But you also need to be able to compare like our ergonomic hazards and MSI injuries, where we need to focus, or is it a different hazard? And so if you're not kind of assigning risk level and looking at the level of risk between your different hazards and within your organization, it's going to be really hard to say, yes, this is where we need to put our time and our effort and our resources versus somewhere else. Hopefully that makes sense, and I apologize for the jumping forward to this without seeing it before. And so we're going to take a bit of a pause on the risk identification. I want to kind of give a bit of an example using some data and information from some of the organizations I work with. So example is East Coast Fisheries. That's a fake company. Some of the data is real from organizations I work with, but the name is not. I looked it up and I couldn't find any company called East Coast Fisheries. So if there is one out there, I do apologize. But this is the kind of the fake company name I came up with. And so if you're thinking of risk identification, you want to start really high level, kind of that reactive approach, and look at the WCB injuries. And so this company had 78% of their WCB injuries were MSIs. So really high amounts of MSIs, much higher than the industry average. I think you guys were 33 to 52. And then even Nova Scotia in general was 64. So these are pretty high. And then if we look at injury costs, the MSIs were accounting for a even higher percentage of their total injury costs. And then we also looked at injury location. So back, upper extremities were the big ones, which is pretty common for injuries. And East Coast Fisheries, we'll call them a seafood processing facility, and as we go through the example here, they have lots of different products that they process. So that's the kind of the high level data. that's typically collected. And sure, from this, we can say the MSIs are an issue. This is something we want to focus on. But what are kind of the next steps? Where do we go from here? And how do we break it down from this information to something a little more manageable in terms of like a task that we can go out into the workplace and look at and try to problem solve for? So that's kind of where the surveys and some of those ergonomic assessment tools come into place. And so I'll start here. So keeping along with this kind of East Coast fisheries, they wanted to survey their production workers. And so they used discomfort surveys. Their production workers were their largest group of employees. And so they had all their production workers complete discomfort surveys. And as we kind of touched on before, the result is we get kind of a heat map in terms of where the discomfort is on the body. And so for this, it was the upper back, the lower back, the shoulders, and the neck area were the areas that were coming up with higher levels of discomfort from the production workers. And so that kind of gives us a place to start. I'll jump back here for a second. If your organization doesn't have production workers, you can really do it with any group of workers. You just take anyone with a job or job title that has similar tasks, and you complete surveys with them, and then review it based on the job. So you'd do surveys with deckhands, with maintenance, and laborers separately, and then you would kind of analyze the surveys based on those three groups to see who had higher levels of discomfort, what kind of tasks were they reporting with discomfort, and that kind of thing. So it gives you some information to start with and move forward with. But for this example, we'll stick with the production workers. And so this is kind of what you're left with from the discomfort survey. And so East Coast Fisheries, they had some neck and shoulder and low back pain. And because the surveys get workers to attach tasks to the discomfort, we're left with a group of, or kind of a list of tasks that people were thinking were causing or aggravating their discomfort. And so I broke it down to the higher risk areas, so shoulder, neck, and back discomfort, and the tasks that people associated with those. So I kind of made these up, but again, sorting product is one that comes up a lot, whether that's your like the initial stages of the production line, or at the end, or in the middle, whether that's like quality assurance line, they're all kind of similar. Shoveling ice out of the fish totes is a common one for shoulder discomfort, and then lifting, carrying bags of scallops. So any kind of lifting and carrying, especially with bags, especially if they're not frozen, they're going to be moving around a little bit, and they're going to be difficult in terms of carrying and lifting. For the neck discomfort, cutting lobster legs, looking down for long periods of time at one workstation, you'd probably see some wrist discomfort come up with cutting lobster legs as well. Want to keep those scissors sharp. And sorting products came up again, and then cutting fish is another one. So again, kind of any workstation that you're at for a longer period of time and you're looking down at and doing your work down there. Back discomfort, lifting crates comes up a lot. Again, I touched on some of the concerns with that. Stacking products on pallets. So at the end of any kind of line, taking your product off the line and putting it on pallets. There's twisting involved, there's awkward postures, it's typically repetitive, and depending on the product size and shape and weight, it might be some high forces there. And then standing for long periods of time, especially if you're at a workstation that's a little bit too low and you're bending over. It might not seem like a lot, but if you're there for 8-10 hours a day, multiple days a week, it can add up over time, and we typically see a lot of back discomfort from standing for long periods of time. Two of the things that I like that the discomfort surveys give you in terms of like trying to start to build that like risk level or the conversation around risk is it gives like average discomfort scores, or you can calculate the average discomfort score, as well as like number of mentions. So I talked about a little bit about it kind of weeding out one large voice complaining about one task and you can start to take the trends that are built. And so that's if 8 people mention shoveling ice as a source of shoulder discomfort, maybe that's something that you want to look into, versus if one person was like, I really have difficulty carrying and lifting bags of scallops. That's you're gonna focus on the area that more people have issues with first, and then you can kind of work your way down. So it gives you an easy kind of numerical way to start to list your tasks that you're gonna start dealing with. So we're going to give a little bit of an example of the sorting product. So let's say out of all the tasks here, sorting product was the one that we wanted to focus on. Maybe we had a couple of time loss injuries, some rotator cuff issues with sorting of the product on our product line, and it was flagged through the discomfort surveys as a high risk task. So that's what we're going to focus on moving forward. And so stepping kind of away from the example for a little bit, I'll go back into it. The third step in this process is that risk assessment. And so why do we do it? So we want to compare hazards and risk types. So we talked about the different types of hazards before. And so you want to be able to at least have a conversation or compare your chemical hazards, your ergonomic hazards, your workplace or your kind of fire hazards, and be able to know where your risk is and what you're going to go deal with first, and where you want to put your time, effort, and resources. So that's kind of one benefit of it. You can understand the potential impact of the business. So thinking about MSIs, are they 80% of our injuries? Are they 20? And that's going to give you a pretty good idea of the impact of the business, and how quickly and how aggressively you want to move forward with kind of any sort of ergonomic program or MSI prevention program. It's also really good for measuring progress. So like if we have a hazard, let's say it's a lifting task, and we put a control in place, we want to be able to go back and say that was effective, it's working well. And so if you do kind of your risk assessment before and after, it can give you a really good idea of like how effective your corrective action or your control was. So really great way to advocate for different controls, especially more effective ones, is to kind of measure the progress and the change of risk from like before you implement something or after. For example, like going back to using equipment to control for like lifts. So if you had equipment to move product around, let's say it was like a pallet jack, and you eliminated a lifting task, well then the risk is gone. You're no longer lifting that product, and so that measured progress goes from a high risk task to pretty much nothing. So you're able to kind of advocate for different controls. And so the way people assess risk is a little different. I'm sure most people have seen some sort of risk assessment like this. You can Google risk assessment, and there's a million of these that come up. I just picked one and went with it. And so it's typically the likelihood of an event happening versus the consequence of that event happening. And so if we're thinking about our ergonomic hazards, and how we kind of integrate our ergonomic hazards into the safety processes that we already have in place. If you guys have something like this, I would just go through and make sure that most people have like definitions for like almost certain, likely, possible, so that if I go and assess the risk for this, and then my colleague goes and assesses the risk using this tool, we want to make sure it's apples to apples and it's consistent. And so you want to go through those definitions and just make sure kind of trial and error go through with an ergonomic hazard, whether it's a lifting task or a push-pull or repetitive, and just go through and what's the likelihood of it happening, and go through and use your process to kind of spit out the end level of risk, just to make sure that you're not overestimating or underestimating the level of risk for a MSI or ergonomic hazard, because they sometimes do come out a little bit wonky. And so you just want to make sure that they're falling into an appropriate line with your other hazards and your other risks. So that's one way of doing it, is kind of using your current kind of heat map risk assessment and just kind of plug and play your ergonomic hazards or MSIs through that. The other way is to use some more ergonomic assessment tools. I have a list of them here. I think the main thing is to just know that there's a variety of ergonomic assessment tools out there. There's some ones that are general MSI risk assessment tools, like the quick exposure checklist down at number 3, and I'll touch on that one a little bit more. Some upper body extremity tools, the rapid upper limb assessment, or RULA, is a more familiar one. It measures kind of like postures and those sorts of things. And then there's some more lifting specific ones for manual handling, like the Nash lifting equation. There's also like lifting calculators out of WorkSafe BC and the Alberta government, which I'll touch on here in a second. But these tools give you a little bit more of like a numerical risk value in the chance, like what is the chance of injury and how bad could it be? These give you a little bit more of a quantitative number. And so they can kind of help you with that risk assessment if you don't want to put your ergonomic hazard or your MSI kind of through your general safety risk ranking system. So just a separate option. So we'll go back to our East Coast fisheries example. So they're going to, if we think kind of back to where we've come, so we did the discomfort surveys for the production workers, and it came out that the sorting product task was pretty high for the shoulder discomfort. It was mentioned a bunch of times, and we also had a couple rotator cuff WCB injuries at that workstation. And so we want to go assess it a little bit further, and we're going to use the quick exposure checklist. So observational tool, you'd go out and you'd go through the checklist, and you'd watch the task being done, and you'd go through and fill it out. And what it's going to spit out to you is kind of this heat map, this risk ranking. And it does it for all the high risk body parts. So it does it for shoulder and back, and the wrist and the neck. And so we kind of get a decent view of all the different areas of the body that are typically injured and that we see with injuries. And it gives kind of that exposure legend. So let's say we went out and we completed that with the sorting task, and this is what it popped out to us. So the results at the sorting product task were, and we can kind of see that exposure legend. So it was very high for the neck. Again, the sorting task, it was the one that we were actually assessing. The workstations were pretty low, and the items that the individual was working with and using and sorting, and some of their equipment was far out from their body. So there was a lot of reaching with the shoulder, kind of distance-wise as well as height. And so that's kind of why the shoulder arm exposure came out a little bit higher. But at the end of the day, it gives us this information and kind of gives us, again, another step to focus on. The one thing I do like about the QEC, and if we had more time, I'd go through it with you, and maybe that's another day. It kind of really breaks down the ergonomic hazards that we talk about. So in the questions that it asks, you're filling information about the amount of force that's applied or lifted, the duration that someone is doing a task, the repetitiveness of it. It goes through different postures for the shoulder and the back. And so it kind of does a very detailed assessment of the work and the work being done based on those ergonomic hazards. And so if you got this, we could actually go back into the assessment and say, what led to the shoulder exposure being high, or what led to the total neck exposure being very high. And so when you want to start to try and control things and reduce the chance of injury, you can focus on maybe it's the force of whatever they're doing was really high, or maybe they're doing it for 8 hours a day with limited breaks, and so the duration was really the main kind of contributor to the risk. So you can go back and see different parts of it, and it kind of breaks it down for you. The resource reminder down at the bottom here, lifting calculators can help assess lifting tasks. And so if you have like very lifting specific tasks, whether it's lifting lobster crates or lifting product from one area to another without carries, then you can use some lifting calculator. So WorkSafe BC has a good one. You can just go on their website and type it in, and it has it right on their website. You can use your phone with it as well. the government of Alberta has one that's more paper-based, but they're pretty similar, and they're both based off like the Nash lifting equation. They're just a little bit more user-friendly. So if you're a safety professional, manager, Josh committee member, and you're looking into a task that has lifting involved with it, and you want to see what pops out of the calculator, feel free to go use that and see what happens, and see the level of risk and what you're dealing with there. So super easy to use and helps out a lot. So we'll go back to the main content here. So step 4, so we went through the risk assessment, and now we're kind of on to the what can we do about it, how can we control the level of risk, and this is the hierarchy of controls. You may have seen it. I think the main thing here is that different controls are going to be more or less effective. I circled or put the square on the bottom 2 because there's really a break between the elimination, substitution, and engineering and the administrative controls and the PPE. The bottom 2 there, we're relying on the workers to kind of make the right choice and do the right thing day in and day out. And I'm sure most of us here know that that doesn't always happen. People make errors, that's expected, and they make the wrong choices. Again, that's going to happen. And so the more we can have our controls in those top 3, which doesn't force the worker to make the right decision day in, day out, the more effective our control is going to be. And so that really comes into play if you have a task that is risky, and if you've gone through your risk assessment and the outcome can be bad, then you might want to look above the PPE and administrative control, at least as a first option. And I mean, administrative controls and PPE have their place, and they're great layers, but just understanding that the effectiveness is lower, especially for kind of your ergonomic hazards, if that's all you're putting in place, then it's important to know and kind of understand the effectiveness of it. So what are some sample controls? So location of materials. So any kind of lifting task, we're a lot stronger if the item is being moved to or from anywhere between our knees and our shoulders. Some people call it like the power range or power zone, working zone. So that kind of comes into play at any workstation or product line. So anything that we're doing repetitively should be in front of us, closer to our belly button, both distance and height. Overhead work, trying to either bring the worker up to the work or the work down to the worker. Visual zones, again, if you're doing work on a line or a table workstation, if you can bring the work up a little bit and have it more in that kind of vision zone, workers are going to be less likely to bend forward and have issues with neck discomfort. Gripping tasks, so that's like any handles that you have, so any product that you're moving around, that's called the power grip, and that's where we're strongest. And so if you have handles or if you're pushing, pulling, those are the kind of the stronger and more effective grips to be able to use on those items. Job rotation is a pretty common one. Really, the main thing there is to make sure that you're rotating people in and around jobs that don't have the same demands. So you don't want to rotate a worker throughout tasks that have upper body repetitive movements or a lot of like back demands. So you want to think about giving the body parts some relief and recovery when you're rotating people around. So understanding the demands of the job are important. You could use discomfort surveys to try and figure that out, or some of the other tools, and just make sure you're giving people a bit of relief when you're moving them around. So going back to our example, East Coast fisheries, we've done the QEC. We know the issues are with neck, bending over, shoulder reaching, and there was a little bit of risk for the back. And so the things that we've come up with are making sure the work was in close to the worker. And so some of the product that were, whether it was on the way in or the way out, some of the boxes and packaging that they were using was either further away, too far away from them, or also up on some shelving. And so that the fix to that was making sure that the workstations were standardized in terms of where the equipment and the product packaging was that they were using, making sure it was close enough into them, and being used for that, and as well as height as well. You want to make sure that things aren't too high, whether you're reaching. For that, the other one was the height of the workstation, and so some of their workstations were fairly low, and so we had to raise them up so that people weren't bending over and looking down as far. It depends on the type of work that you're doing. For light work, so most of the stuff on like a processing line, unless you're kind of like breaking lobsters apart or using some force, most of it should be a couple inches below elbow height. If you are using any sort of force or higher demands, I always give the example of like if you're cutting sweet potato with a dull knife, you want your table to be even lower, because you need to kind of get up and over it. So you'd want that kind of below your elbow height. And then I did say that you want your light work to be below elbow height, but you want your light work to be above elbow height. So it's a little bit closer to you, and you're able to kind of use your fine motor skills for the higher demand or the force that you need, such as cutting a sweet potato with a dull knife. You want that below elbow height so that you can kind of get over it and apply some force down. The other one that they implemented was around people were standing in one position, bending over slightly for long periods of time. So they had sit-stool desks or sit-stand stools. The main thing here was just to give people an ability to move around, have a different posture, and to kind of be able to get out of the one posture they're in. Other options here are to make a little footrest under the table. This was kind of figured out in bars a very long time ago. When you're standing at a bar, most of them have a little footrest down at the bottom near your feet so that you can rotate your feet back and forth, alter your posture, and you're able to maintain that same position for longer. At the bar, you're there for longer and you're spending more money. Here, you're more comfortable at work and able to alter your position a little bit. So same theory, and giving people a different option in terms of posture and standing and things like that. So those were the three controls that they came up with for this work and how they went through the different assessments. Another resource reminder, so the Ontario Health Clinic for Workers, or the Occupational Health Clinic for Ontario Workers, OCAO has a anthropometric calculator. It's a app and it's cool. You can go on and actually figure out, like let's say you had 10 workers along a line, or you had 10 workers and you wanted to figure out, we can't make the workstations adjustable, but we want to fix the height so that it's in the average, so it's not too bad for one person, it's not too terrible for the tallest or shortest. You could actually go on and say, let's say your average height of your workers in that group or your workforce was 5'6". You could go on and see what is the elbow height of a 5'6" female. Let's say they're female workers, and that will pump out the actual elbow height. And so if it's light work, you'd go a couple inches below. If it's more demanding work, you'd go a little bit above, but you can start to get at least a general idea of workstation heights and things like that. So encourage you to go on and take a look at that to help out if you do have any questions around what height should workstations be at. Training content, and so this is really just for all workers: signs and symptoms, MSI hazards, relevant policies and use of controls, and then your Josh members, your reps, supervisors, and managers are going to get some additional training on top of that. And so it's just important to be aware of what, especially for your MSI content, what do you want to train your workers on? You can take a look at whether it's orientation or kind of refresher training that you currently have. And you can go on and look at what do you have for your frontline workers, and then what additional content you have for your Josh members and reps and stuff like that. It's mainly around the big difference is kind of whether they're identifying and controlling hazards, or if they're using controls and policies and procedures and things like that. some MSI content that you can be aware of. The evaluation stage, so again, kind of that continuous improvement, making sure your program is doing what you want. I always think of like just focus on the process, hazards identified, hazard assess, and assign risk levels. Look at controls or corrective actions implemented, individuals trained on ergonomic hazards. So you can kind of measure whatever you think is important in your own organization. I always like to try and advise that you pick a few things to measure at each stage along the process so that you can know what's going well and what's not. Maybe you are doing hazard ID really well, but the control implementation isn't going as well as you would like it to. So you can kind of figure out what part of the process you are doing well and what part of the process you are needing some improvement on. But super important, especially for the kind of the continual loop of it to go on and move forward and make things better and just keep improving. So leading indicators and lagging, very similar to like the reactive and proactive. It's a balanced approach is best so that you can kind of be looking at all angles. So again, kind of pick a couple indicators that are at each steps along the way of your safety process that account for some ergonomic hazards and MSIs. And just track them and see how well things are going, and look at them kind of year in and year out. So that's kind of the 6 steps broken down. Some examples in there as well. That's on our Work Safe for Life. And again, there's the MSD prevention one out of Ontario as well, which gives a little bit more of a detailed look, but they cover a lot of the same topics with kind of the ergonomic assessment tools, and how do we identify these MSIs being a specific focus of all of them. So here's a list of the resources that I talked about, just to kind of give a couple of links and where you can find them. The quick exposure checklist, you can just Google that, and that'll come up for sure. But those are resources, the ones that I use quite a bit. And so you can go take a check and see if they can help you guys in your own workplace. So I know we're pretty short here for time, but I'm definitely down to answer some questions.
All right, so thanks, Sean, and this is your opportunity certainly to pose any questions to Sean. What you've heard today, obviously, we've heard some great information with regards to lowering the risk and obviously the cost that employers face with regards to MSIs. So certainly feel free. I don't see anything in the chat, but again, this is your opportunity. So feel free to either put your hand up if you have any questions, or type anything into the chat, and we'll certainly address them. I see Lisa's just commenting that there was lots of great info, Sean, so that was great.
A lot of information, probably pretty quick.
We will certainly be sending out a copy of the, when we have it posted, of the recorded presentation. So people that have joined today will be able to reshare it as well, but it'll also be available on our website too. As one of my former leaders always say, I'm okay with an awkward pause. It's all good. Sometimes people have to formulate their questions and give you the chance. Maybe there isn't any, but it's all good. And we'll wait just another minute or two to see if there's anyone that had any questions that they wanted to pose. It's okay to be the first one too. It's all right. I know it's never the most favorite part. Once generally questions start to flow, more questions come after that, but it's all good either way. Aha! Jennifer Bolivar, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I've been having, as you know, Brad, audio issues the whole time, so it's been cutting in and out. My apologies, and
No
kind of a
problem.
bummer because I'm sure I missed a bunch of points. But hi, Sean. My name is Jen Bolivar. I am an officer with Labor Skills and Immigration. I just wanted to ask you just a question. I may have missed this. So I actually participate in the lobster industry on boats. Have you has people from WCB actually been out on the actual lobster boats to um, do like an ergonomic assessment with the lobster fisher community? I'd assume you would. And my second part of that is how do you see the buy-in from a lot of the lobster fisher community going to follow this ergonomics assessment and recommendations. I'm just wondering how that's going to all unfold and how we can assist you too with that as well. I hope that question is okay.
Yeah, for sure. Me personally, so I don't complete assessments. So my role, and maybe I should have had this at the very beginning, my role is in like a coaching and support role. And so I help organizations go out and complete their own assessments, whether that's through training and education and using some of these tools. And so I personally haven't gone out and completed any kind of ergonomic assessments on fishing boats. And so that kind of answers the first one. I don't know of any companies who have done any assessments out on boats. I've done a few with like processing facilities. There's been a few boats we've looked at that are more on your kind of, I mean, they're larger boats with a lot of different tasks, some similar to the processing facilities like on the boats. So we've done some work there, but no like specific ergonomic assessments on those. So that's that first one. In terms of buy-in, I mean, most of my work comes through the processing industry and sector, I guess you could call it. So I'd have to say the buy-in for that group is maybe a little bit stronger. I mean, that might just come from like education awareness. I mean, manufacturing and ergonomics gets tied together quite a bit more than ergonomics and fishing, especially like harvesting and things like that. So it might just be the manufacturing space has come a little bit further in terms of knowledge and awareness and that kind of thing. That'd be my guess. But that's the only information I'd have to kind of talk about like buy-in. I haven't had any boats that I've tried to work with that have said no. So yeah, that would be my comments on those two questions.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. I just, yeah, like I can understand the saltwater, processing facilities, of course, they're more of an organized business and, have their own safety procedures, stuff like that. Having said that, so do the vessels. And I know that that's, it's kind of a path that we're in the middle of right now, trying to get a lot of the boat operators to, have their safety manuals and processes and procedures up to place. So, and, if you look at, are you familiar, I'd assume, with the Wheelhouse logbook that Fish Safe Nova Scotia has done? There is a lot of great ergonomic information in that as well. So, it's a start, and I think it's going to be a harder industry to reach the vessels per se than it is the saltwater industry. And I think that that's something that between WCB, LSI, and Fish Safe Nova Scotia, and the fish sectors councils, all that stuff, that's something that we're all going to probably journey on together eventually. So I really appreciated your presentation. It was very, very informative. So thank you very much.
Appreciate it. And yeah, I agree with everything you're saying.
Thanks, Jen. So did anyone else have any additional questions? I do know that it is 2:34, but if anyone was sticking around to ask those questions, that's what we're here for. So feel free, and then we'll wrap up right after that. I'll just give another moment just for anyone that might have anything that they wanted to ask. Some information was just put into the chat box with regards to closing us out. But again, if anyone else had any other questions, now's your time to certainly put that forward. We'd love to hear your question if you do have one. Well, Sean, hearing not maybe. We'll certainly, I think we'll wrap it up for here. You certainly have the ability to contact us should you have any questions. We encourage you, of course, to make the right call. Contact the safety branch, 1-800-9-LABOR, which is 1-800-952-2687. Certainly email us at any point in time at safetybranch@novascotia.ca. Certainly feel free. We can always contact Sean if it's a question around ergonomics and so on to see if we can get you some answers. Of course, we always encourage you to visit WorkSafe for Life's website, and the links there are also in that chat. WorkSafeForLife.ca. Our safety branch website is now located and easy to access at safetybranch.ca, which is brand new. So not the website, but the way to which to get to it. So much easier to be able to find us at just safetybranch.ca. So be aware of that. And another great way to review safety information in Nova Scotia, of course, is always to visit NovaSafe. We continue to build NovaSafe every year. More topics are being added each and every year. So we encourage you to either get that on your phone or go ahead and visit the website. Again, novasafe.ca is a great access for additional information with regards to safety in the province. And since I've been doing talking and nobody else has typed anything or I see anything basically with hands up, we'll conclude our webinar for today. I'd like to thank you again for joining us, and work safe, home safe every day. Thank you so much.